This is United States History 202, Presentation 7, Immigration, the Rise of the City, and Labor. So what we're going to look at here are, we talked about the wealthy in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So what we're going to do in this particular presentation is talk about some of the other issues that are affecting working class people in these urban areas throughout the northern part of the United States in particular. Some of these issues wouldn't affect the South very much, and so we've already talked about the New South and labor there. But immigration is going to have an impact in the United States at this time, and of course, because so many people are moving into the United States, you're going to see the expansion and growth of cities. And with the industrialization of the United States, labor is going to change drastically in this period of time too, as more and more people move off farms and into factory work. You saw it in the North much more quickly, though by the end of the 20th century you see it much more pronounced in the South as well. But as we've seen, not many Southerners worked in factory work. Most are still on farms. You could say that in the West as well, but really in your northeastern areas and midwestern areas, you're talking about your major cities like Chicago and Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, these areas. And we'll look at the growth of cities a little bit, but when you talk about those areas, that's where you're getting into this massive growth in terms of expansion of population. So we're going to talk about immigration in the new city. We'll look at poverty. We'll look at sanitation and fires, which is a big issue. And we'll talk about labor conditions and labor unrest. So first and foremost, looking at immigration, a lot of that comes down to the 14th Amendment. The Supreme Court of the United States interpreted the 14th Amendment differently in this period of time. And their interpretation, or at least the way the 14th Amendment was originally supposed to be interpreted, but when the Supreme Court starts altering the way the 14th Amendment would be interpreted, you get a fundamental change in immigration law to the United States. In fact, in 1898, through a Supreme Court decision known as United States v. Wong Kim Ark, the Supreme Court said that all children born in the United States are citizens of the United States. So all you have to be is born in the United States. That changes everything, because essentially what happens, you don't have to have American parents or one American parent or anything. As long as you're born here, you're a citizen. So when you have immigrants coming in the United States that are women that are pregnant and they have a child here, that child is now a United States citizen no matter what the status of their parents are. So that creates a situation known as anchor babies. And this is going to be a major issue moving forward in the United States history, even to this day. So when we're talking about immigration reform or looking at immigration and on both sides of the issue, this is one of the issues that comes up. How do you handle all these people coming in the United States? And then what do you do with people that are pregnant and have a child here? What is the status of that child? If the parents are illegally here, but the child is a citizen, what do you do in that case? So this is a major transformation. In 1898, the problem wasn't so pronounced, but of course, as we move forward into 2013 and beyond, it is a much bigger issue. So in the 19th and 20th century, you had a phase called new immigration. And most of the people coming to the United States from Europe at this point were coming from Eastern and Central Europe. So this is from 1850 to 1930. At this particular point, the melting pot idea was challenged. In fact, one politician said America was now the dumping ground rather than the melting pot, because a lot of the people coming in to the United States at this point were not Western European. They had very little education. They didn't speak English. And they didn't really have many opportunities. So essentially what we were getting in this politician's eyes was that we were having all these poor people come in the United States and really nothing for them to do. And this was driving down wages and other things. So these people were coming from Italy, Russia, Austria, Hungary, Germany, Poland, the Balkans, Jews. So this is really going to change the social and ethnic dynamic of the United States, particularly in your larger cities like New York again, and on the East Coast and other areas as well. And there was a concern with assimilation. How are these people going to become American? If they didn't speak English, if they didn't have any desire to speak English, I think you can say in this regard, though, that was a little bit unfounded, because most of these people within a generation would be speaking English and would be very much Americanized. They still would hang on to some of their cultural past, but they would become Americanized. But that was still an issue here in the 19th and 20th century, something we're still talking about today. With all these new people coming to the United States, should they assimilate or should they not assimilate? I mean, this is one of the major issues. And so opportunity was another issue. What kind of opportunities people are going to have here, and what kind of hardships are they going to face? What is this going to do to our cities, our natural resources, all these kind of things, crime, poverty. All these things are major issues when you start talking about large influxes of people through immigration. So you can see the immigration pattern here is from 1861 to 1900, and this is in millions. So you can see between 1881 and 1895, there were over 2 million people a year coming to the United States. And you can see there were some periods with a little less, but that's a lot of people. I'm sorry, not a year. This was in total 5-year period. So you're talking about almost 3 million people between 81 and 85. So you're looking at a little less than 1 million people a year. But that is still a substantial amount of people coming into cities across the United States. Again, in this period of time, you started seeing more people from Eastern and Southern Europe, Central Europe. You still had a lot of British and Irish, but still people coming from more diverse places. And then you move forward into the early 20th century, and you can see now you're getting almost 1 million people a year. In 1916, you have World War I, which is going to curtail immigration substantially, and it's also in that time the United States will pass some immigration reforms which will cut immigration, so that's why the numbers are down there. And at this point, you can see it's almost all people from Central and Eastern Europe, very few people from Northwestern Europe. Now, the symbol of the new immigration to the United States, of course, is the Statue of Liberty, which is at the mouth of the Hudson River in New York City. It was gifted to the United States by France in 1886, and it was designed by a man named Frederick Bartholdi. Now, there was a lot of opposition to this in New York because the governor of New York at the time was Grover Cleveland when the idea was put forward, and he didn't want it. Now, when the Statue of Liberty is unveiled, Grover Cleveland is president at that point, and he has to make a speech in favor of the statue. But even at this point, people in New York were saying, well, you know, I don't know if we want this to be our image. If we just want to be a place where lots of people will come, and you're destroying the city in their mind because so many people were flooding into the city and there was nothing for them to do. You're increasing poverty and other things. So this was the problem. And of course, the inscription on the Statue of Liberty essentially opens the door to people who are coming who are destitute, have nothing. And the idea was that, of course, they would come here and get and make a better way for themselves. And of course, that's the point for all these people coming to the United States. They want to make a better way for themselves. These people were hardworking people. They wanted jobs. They wanted opportunity, and the United States presented that in the 19th and 20th century. So, looking back on it, these people, of course, you know, they helped build the United States. Now, Ellis Island, New York, was the most famous federal processing station for new immigrants. It was an operation from 1892 to 1954. But after 1924, only displaced persons and war refugees were admitted through Ellis Island. So you're talking about people that were displaced by war. Estimates range that between 12 million and 50 million people were processed there. But many immigrants were also turned away because immigrants had to pass a physical. They had to answer a series of questions that could lead to deportation. And these questions range from things like, are you pregnant? Do you have, if you're a woman, do you have a husband? If you are pregnant, who can provide for you? What kind of diseases do you have? Can you speak English? And there's all kinds of things they could ask you. Most immigrants who arrived at Ellis Island were poor, without the prospect of work. So sometimes they could ask, do you have a job? So this created a fear of a very large urban proletariat. And again, these new immigrants were from Italy, Russia, Eastern Europe, a lot of Jews. So they weren't the same ethnic background as the people that were already here. So this is going to create some tension. And here are some images I have of people arriving at Ellis Island, people waiting to be processed at Ellis Island, and you can look at these on your own. Again, a child waiting to be processed at Ellis Island. Women, you can see they don't have any shoes, so they're very poor. And this again was the concern. More people waiting to be processed. There's what Ellis Island looked like around the early 20th century, at the height of its operation. And you can see behind it there's a bustling harbor there, wharf, a lot of economic activity. And then Ellis Island was left to ruin. You can see the economic activity behind it now has gone down to nothing. Ellis Island has been abandoned. So now it's actually open as a museum. This is what it looks like today. So a lot of people will take the ferry out there and go and tour the building. It's a very beautiful building, Victorian architecture, and so it's a big tourist attraction now. Now, as I mentioned before, there were going to be some immigration restrictions in this point. So this is nothing new when people talk about this today. We've done it before in the United States. But between 1917 and 1920, you had literacy tests. So you actually had to be able to read. to be able to enter the United States. And then in the 1920s, you started seeing quotas. So only a certain amount of people were allowed in from a country in a given year. So if you couldn't exceed the quota. So if you were the first person over the quota, you'd have to wait till the next year. So this was because of opposition to mass numbers of non-Western Europeans to the United States. And this is where you get the Immigration Act of 1924. Again, quotas placed on immigration. So less than 4,000 people annually were remitted from non-Western European countries after the act passed, and immigration from Asia halted. So Latin American immigration, though, was ignored. And that became a major component of immigration. So you can see the impact of the Immigration Act of 1924. It swung the numbers back the other direction from northwestern Europe, where it was going for the other way throughout much of American history leading up to this point in the last few decades. And you can see the impact it had on immigration overall. So between 21 and 25, numbers go down to 3 million people, less than 3 million people in that 5-year period, less than 1.5 million people between 26 and 30. Then you have the Great Depression. But you can see even in the 40s and World War II, in the 40s and 50s, it still slowly creeps back up. There's not this large burst of immigrants coming in the United States. But you can see Latin America now will make 35% of the immigrants coming in. So this is drastically going to change the nature of immigration to the United States. Now, the forgotten group in all this, of course, are the Chinese. The first Chinese immigrants arrived in the United States around 1820. They were mostly men. In fact, the ratio of men to women of Chinese descent was 1,685 to 1. So the women that did come to the United States oftentimes were imported, unfortunately, as prostitutes and other things. So this was a very bad situation. And many people left China to escape political trouble, the Opium Wars. So that was a major issue in China at the time. So they're trying to come to the United States, again, for opportunity, economic opportunity, to get away from war. The United States represented a place of peace and prosperity. Many of the new Chinese immigrants were lured to the United States by the California Gold Rush of the 1840s, and so they became an integral part of the boom towns of the West in the mid to late 19th century. Many Chinese miners settled in San Francisco and added to the culture of the city. In fact, you had your first Taoist temples in the United States in San Francisco. So this is an area that you had, say, for example, your first Chinatown in the United States. The California, because of this, though, would pass a series of laws limiting civil rights for Chinese immigrants in the 1850s. And part of this legislation was a tax imposed on non-white peoples of the territory and then later the state. And since very few other non-white peoples were in California, this excluded American Indians. The tax was almost exclusively paid by the Chinese. So this was a targeted tax on Chinese immigrants. Now, the Chinese are going to work very hard in trying to make a way for themselves in mining projects, but also in railroad projects. In fact, they're an integral part of the Central Pacific Railroad, which was part of the Transcontinental Railroad system. They went from California to Utah. So most of the construction workers on the project for the Central Pacific were Chinese laborers. The company did have to pay 1/3 less for Chinese workers and did not provide board or lodging, so they worked for less. This was the complaint oftentimes. These people are working for less. They don't require the same as Irish workers or other people. So this is part of the hostility to Chinese immigration at the time in the 1860s. Now, in 1863, though, the United States will pass something called the Burlingame Treaty. This increased Chinese immigration to the United States after the two countries established a friendly relationship. China was granted most favored nation status, and many of the Chinese immigrants established Chinatowns in American cities. Now, they had already started this in San Francisco, but you're going to start seeing it spread out further. And they were viewed as dangerous because they didn't want to assimilate. That was the problem in their eyes. The Chinese would hang on to their language, their culture. They wouldn't become Americanized. And so this became the real issue in a lot of Americans' opinion, that the Chinese just were not willing to assimilate and become like other Americans. So racism is going to is going to be fueled from an increasing number of Chinese immigrants in competition for jobs. The racial slur coolie was used to slander Chinese laborers and immigrants. The Chinese did work for less and required less compensation than white workers, even some black workers. So even black Americans are not happy about the fact that the Chinese are here because they're now getting undercut. And so this is going to lead to violence in parts of the West against Chinese laborers. So in 1882, the government will pass something called the Chinese Exclusion Act. This law outlawed Chinese immigration for a period of 10 years. It was renewed indefinitely until it was repealed in 1943, and there's a reason why it was repealed in 1943. During World War II, China was our ally against the Japanese. So we couldn't prohibit immigration from China if we're on their side or they're on our side fighting the Japanese, so it was seen as immoral. In fact, President Grover Cleveland called the Chinese a danger to the United States and a people not capable of assimilation with American culture. He said it's just not going to work. So he was highly suspicious of massive Chinese immigration to the United States. Again, people that oppose immigration in the modern political climate, they're seen as these oddballs, that this is anti-American, but this has actually been a major trend in American history. Not opposing immigration has actually been the exception rather than the rule. Now, what were the problems of mass immigration? Overcrowding, poverty, disease, fire, urbanization would place a strain on resources for major cities. So you have police protection, fire departments, water, sewer, all those things. When you have lots of people moving into an area, you have to plan for those things or it's going to overload those systems. Now, the population growth of cities, I talked about that before. You can see it here. I'm not going to test you on these numbers, but this is just to give you an example. I mean, look at New York. It almost doubles in population in 20 years. Detroit goes from 45,000 in 1860 to almost 2 million by 1950. Now, a lot of that was people moving to Detroit for the auto industry, and the trend now is back the other way, way back the other way. But you saw all of your major cities in the North and the Midwest see substantial growth in population during this period. In fact, in New York City, the population density was, on average, 143 people per square acre. It was as high as 700 people per square acre in some parts of New York City. And by the early 20th century, 40% of the American population lived in cities. This includes the South, remember. So in the South, even in 1930, 70% of the South was still rural, but only 44% for the rest of the United States. So if you get out of the South, the majority of people, and even the Mountain West, but you get out of those two areas, and the majority of the people are now living in cities, which is going to drastically change the political climate, the economic climate, the way people think about things. So this is a major deal. Now, a lot of these people are going to live in what we call tenement houses, or they're slums. They might not have windows or plumbing or heat. They could have open sewers behind them, like this particular building. So this is a very bad situation for these people to get into. This is extremely poor, terrible conditions. It's rough. And here are some pictures of the tenement houses. I just showed you one there. There's another one, the interior of a tenement house. So this is a bad environment. A man named Jacob Riis would try to document this problem in 1890 with a book entitled How the Other Half Lives. And here he went out he took pictures of all the poor people in New York City to try to expose the problem. I mean, here we have all these immigrants here. They don't have enough. There's a real problem here. So he's trying to draw attention to the problem of mass immigration and poverty in New York City. And I have a number of pictures here that you can look at yourself. Here's some cigar rollers. They lived and worked in that one room. Same thing with these people. They didn't work in that room, but everyone lived in that one room, all those kids. Here's a tenement house, very poorly constructed, bad situation. This is a lean-to. You might have one of those by your shed. You might put your lawnmower under it, your boat, but people actually lived in these things up next to buildings in this period of time. A number of people living in a one-room apartment, not even an apartment really, it's just kind of a room. So immigrants would have that kind of situation. These were cots. You could pay a nickel a night and you get to sleep in a hammock or a cot. So if you didn't have a home, you could stay there. Now, fires were a serious problem in the 19th century, and there's a lot of reasons for this. First and foremost, buildings were very closely built together and built primarily of wood. There were no fire codes. There was no standardized fire equipment. So when fires broke out, you have wood buildings closely built together, you're going to have fires spread pretty quickly. There were only volunteer fire companies, and this could actually create problems because these volunteer fire companies would show up, might have two volunteer companies show up, and they'd actually fight each other and not put out the fire. So that could create a bad situation. And heating and cooking were still accomplished with an open flame, so this is going to start fires very easily. Now, the other thing that made putting out fires with volunteer companies interesting was that if you didn't have your building insured, fire insurance on your building, people wouldn't put out the fire. So these were insurance fire markers, and if the fire department pulled up and they saw that you didn't have an insurance marker on the outside of your building, they wouldn't put out the fire. They might try to save the buildings next to your building, not keep the fire from spreading, maybe try to save a few things out of the building, but they're not going to put it out because they're not going to get paid. So this is where volunteer fire companies are, they have to make money too. So if you didn't have an insurance company backing up your building, they didn't want to put out the fire. Now, there were major fires all throughout the North in this period of time. The Chicago fire of 1871 destroyed most of the city. Hundreds were killed. But there are other major fires in Boston, Baltimore, Jacksonville, Florida, San Francisco. So if you had a major city, you were susceptible to fire in the 19th century. Here's a before and after, same building in the Chicago fire. You can see how bad this was. Here's the Baltimore fire in 1904. And fires tend to create their own energy, so as they get going, they create their own wind, and you really can't escape them. So this is why hundreds of people would be killed in these fires. There's the Boston fire of 1872, a picture of it. The San Francisco fire of 1906, caused by an earthquake and then later a fire. Now, the Chicago fire was actually part of something called the Peshtigo fire. This is the deadliest fire in American history. There were about 2,000 deaths. 1.5 million acres were burned. But this was a series of fires, including the one in Chicago on the same day, and there is a theory that actually a comet caused this fire, the comet Biela. Now, NASA denies it, but it's possible. They were finding people with burned lungs in the middle of fields, so maybe that could have been the case. Now, of course, when you have people flooding into cities, and you have tenement houses and other things, you can have sanitation problems. Here's urban children playing next to a dead horse carcass. Here's the communal toilet in New York City tenement. So one toilet for the entire building, and you can see it's not very clean, and one sink for the entire building, which is not very clean. So this is a pretty nasty situation. Of course, disease could be spread more easily by this. You had the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. Tuberculosis was a real issue. So people were facing terrible situations. Air pollution was a problem. Very dirty air in these cities. Unhealthy environments, to say the least. Here's a picture of some air pollution. Now, labor regulations did not exist in the United States prior to the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Most workers were required to work about 6 days a week and as many as 14 hours a day. Laborers had little recourse in employment, so if you were fired for any reason, you couldn't sue or anything. There was no workman's compensation. There was none of that. And so if you couldn't work, you weren't paid. The iron law of wages applied to compensation, meaning if there were a lot of workers for a very few amount of jobs, you would see wages extremely low. If it was the other way around, you would see wages higher. And you had, of course, cheap immigrant labor compounding the problem to a lot of Americans. So this is when you're going to get the rise of labor unions and violent strikes and labor unrest. The late 19th century was a period of time where you had extremely violent labor conditions and unrest in labor conditions. One of the most powerful labor unions was a union called the Knights of Labor, led by Terence Powderly. Had about 700,000 members by the 1880s. It was all-inclusive. Women and minorities were invited to join, and it was not a skilled union, so you didn't have to be a skilled worker to join it. But the problem with the Knights of Labor to a lot of workers is that they opposed the strike. So the thing was, well, how are you going to get what you want if you're not willing to strike? Well, they called for an 8-hour workday, abolition of child labor, government ownership of railroads and the telegraph. They wanted paper money and income tax. But again, if you're not willing to strike, how are you going to get these things? Which was always the critique of the Knights of Labor. On the other hand, you had Samuel Gompers, who led the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, which is still around. It is a skilled trade union, so only skilled workers, masons, sheet metal workers, plumbers, people like that can join the AFL. And it was a federal system like the United States. So each union was kind of autonomous under the larger arching structure of the AFL. It's still around, but they would strike. And strikes in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries were often violent affairs. They involved local police or private detective agencies, and at times the U.S. Army. And so I've listed a lot of the strikes here. The Great Railway Strike of 1877, which involved the U.S. Army. The Haymarket Square Riot of 1886, which involved scabs and union workers and the Chicago police. In fact, the leaders of this riot were actually executed. The Homestead Strike of 1891, which involved the Pennsylvania State Police and also a private detective agency. The Pullman Strike of 1894, which involved the U.S. Army. The Ludlow Massacre of 1914, where you had coal strikers, women and children primarily, though, because the men weren't attacked, killed in this particular strike. And then you had the Battle of Blair Mountain in 1921, where the U.S. Army is called in, and they actually dropped bombs on the strikers. The first and only time in American history that bombs were dropped on Americans on purpose. So you had a labor strike. So this is a pretty violent period of time. It's not like today where people stand out with a board and say, you know, I want $25 an hour instead of $20, and I want all my benefits paid instead of 80%, or whatever the case may be. These people actually had to go to war for their rights as workers. This is a very violent period of time. All right, so that's it for presentation. That's it for presentation 7. So I will pick up with presentation 8 next time, and see you then.